Hello everybody, my name is Dratnos and welcome to This Week in Mythic Plus. This week's affixes are Bolstering, Explosive, Tyrannical, and the Awakened pattern. Man, I don't know, it doesn't matter, it's a bad week. Wow, in-game the rain has just started here, and that is exactly what this week feels like compared to last week and to next week in terms of the affixes. Bolstering and Explosive in combination really make it impossible to do large-sized pulls in many dungeons, and that'll really slow you down in trash pulling. And you can't really afford to lose that time when pulling trash this week because Tyrannical is active as well, and that's going to make your boss fights take a really long time also. So it's a really slow week, and it's a week also where in high-level keys, once you start getting above like I don't know, in the 20 range where Tyrannical starts to become way harder than Fortified, this week is one where just the timer is oppressively difficult. So you're not going to see any top scores on leaderboards this week from any teams that will be putting them up next week or that put them up last week. But it's still an okay week to do 15s in. Bolstering is annoying there, and so is Explosive, but it's not prohibitive. And in some cases, Tyrannical can feel a lot easier than Fortified in those cases, particularly if you're doing Keystones at a level where you can safely just pull, one pack at a time and still get your way through the dungeon. This is a week where the affixes don't punish you too much if that's what you're doing, depending on the dungeon. Now, in some dungeons, either Bolstering or Explosive or both have some pretty rough implications, so let's go dungeon by dungeon to talk about those. Okay, so let's start off with Atal'Dazar. As always, my routes are available in the description below, and they're on Radar.io every week. So Atal'Dazar this week it's a really tough week here for a lot of different reasons. Let's start off, let's just go affix by affix. Bolstering is really obnoxious in this middle area because you have these Sky Screamers and the Swords. The Swords are really deadly, so you want to kill them quickly, but the Sky Screamers have a lot more health, so if you kill the Swords quickly, the Sky Screamers are going to get very bolstered. The solution to this is to find ways to pull areas like this where you crowd control this Sky Screamer, you kill all these Swords together, and then you kill 3 Sky Screamers together. And you can do that in here, you can do it up here, you can do it here. There are ways you can do this to speed things up, but it requires you to have more efficiency with that as a group. And if you're pulling 9, 15 Sky Screamers at once, Explosive might start to become a problem. With Tyrannical and Explosive active, this is also a dungeon where all of the bosses have ads in places that, some of them are going to be closer to the boss than others, but you can get Explosive spawning on far totems on Volcall, and that, if your group isn't aware of it, if you're not looking for it, that can really quickly overwhelm you. One Explosive going off on Tyrannical Volcall can often spell the end there. And to top it all off, the Awakened Obelisk situation in Atal'Dazar is really bad. It's worse than almost any other dungeon. You have these 2 obelisks here that both, usually most pre-Season 4 routes, wouldn't go to both this wing of the dungeon and this wing of the dungeon. You would just do one of those 2. And now you're kind of obligated to go to both of them, and you're obligated to find a way to activate this obelisk and this obelisk, both of which are guarded by packs that you don't actually want to pull. So you're going to need to do something like somebody pulling stuff to the side and vanishing, or fighting one of these awakened enemies with the last boss. The easiest candidate for that is the blob here, and that's something that many groups are going to be doing, is fighting the blob with the last boss, but I've left that out of the route because with the Tyrannical last boss, even the blob, which is fairly the same counterplay as Yasma already has, it still adds quite a lot of difficulty to a difficult Tyrannical fight. So all in all, I think you're gonna find this dungeon to be a pretty tricky one this week. Freehold isn't too bad this week. Bolstering isn't a huge problem in here because most enemies have about the same amount of health as each other. And Explosive can get a little bit out of hand if you pull a lot of enemies at once, but you don't really need to do that in here all that often. You can usually get away with pulling 5 to 7 enemies in most cases, especially once you've joined the crew here. Most of these packs get fairly small and manageable. You can try and do a first pull here like this of 9 enemies all at once. It's a good way to get ahead on the dungeon on count. It's a good way to get value out of popping cooldowns before starting the key, like Metamorphosis, Incarnation. Those sorts of cooldowns you can start right before the key starts and still carry them into the first 20 seconds of the key. That's a good way to get use out of those. But this week, since it's Tyrannical, I wouldn't recommend committing a Bloodlust to something like that. I would save the Bloodlust for the boss fight. So if that scares you off of doing this kind of pull, you can back off of it and you can just do this in 2 pulls. You could even skip this trash pack entirely and just go straight to the boss. Or you could even add in like this, so you could split it up like this, for instance, and then pull these two together after, and you've got 2 medium-sized pulls instead of 1 large pull, and then you can cut some count elsewhere to make up for the count that you've added by adding in these. King's Rest, it's one of the weeks where the affixes themselves aren't actually too impactful in here. So Bolstering, there are a few spots where it's going to be annoying, but for the most part, pulls in here are pretty small and full of pretty similarly sized enemies. If you can avoid these minions Azul bolstering anything, which can sometimes happen and cost you a lot of time, so you got to be careful of that. And if you can avoid, wiping in this room as a result of the bolstering on these slimes, that you're going to be pretty much in the clear on that affix. Explosive also not too bad in here because there's generally not too many enemies that you're fighting at once. Tyrannical is a problem here. Tyrannical, explosive, like when you get the totems spawning from Xanazal the Wise, and you've got explosives far, and you've got other stuff going on that fight, that can be a pain. Explosives on this boss fight when you're getting feared and there's, a bunch of priority damage that you need to be doing. Those sorts of things can cause you problems. But really the tough part is Tyrannical, not I'd say explosive or bolstering in here this week. So all in all, it's a hard week, and King's Rest is a hard dungeon. But relative to most weeks, King's Rest is this is an okay week for it. Relative to most of the dungeons this week, King's Rest is one of the less impacted dungeons. Bolstering is really annoying in Shrine of the Storm this week. Most of the small enemies in here don't bolster, but Tidesage Initiates do, and Tidesage Initiates are all over the place in the first half of the dungeon. To get around this, I'm advising just skipping this whole section. You're giving up on a lot of nice count here, but you get to skip all of the pains of figuring out how to deal with bolstering, and there's a lot of stuff that can go wrong in this section. So instead, I'm pulling stuff that I think is slightly less efficient, but a lot safer in this area because, these skeletons don't bolster, and that makes this pulling these things a little bit less likely to go horribly wrong with bolstering active. It's still a tough dungeon for this week, and bolstering in here, I think, is still something that you really just need to always be aware of, otherwise you can get yourself into serious trouble. Bolstering Siege of Boralus can be a positive thing. Ashvane Spotters can do the entire dungeon for you if you set up your route for it. This is not that route. This is a much more kind of standard route that says we're just going to go through the dungeon normally, and hopefully that's that's going to be good enough, and we're not going to have to deal with the difficult execution challenge of bolstering up an Ashvane Spotter. But if you wanted to do this dungeon on a high key level and actually have a hope of timing it at a really high key level this week, you would want to use the Ashvane Spotters, bolster them up, and then just have them, like you'd be using obelisks to skip as much of the early part of the dungeon as possible, and then you'd be getting this spotter or this spotter bolstered all the way up, and using them to get all the count in here in 1 or 2 explosions from their casts. That kind of strategy is really high risk, but really high reward, so I've left it out of the route just because of how difficult it is to do, and because of how risky it is, but it is something to think about. I'm not saying that this is the best way to do this key at a very high level. Either way, no matter how you do Siege this week, it's going to be difficult. Explosive, tyrannical bosses in here, pretty obnoxious as well. Getting, this boss fight takes a really long time. You got explosive spawning on far tentacles. And that, I think, no matter what your strategy for dealing with trash in this dungeon is, you really need to have a good execution of these last 2 boss fights if you want to have hope of beating this key this week. Temple of Sethraliss, kind of like King's Rest, in that bolstering and explosive are not going to be 2 impactful affixes in here this week. With one exception on that front, and that is explosive on the last boss is actually pretty annoying. So on this last boss, you get these 4 hexers that spawn in different corners of the room, and each of those is a locus from which explosives can spawn. So that's something that you need to have. Usually what you're going to want to do this week is you're going to want to assign one person who has a pretty easy time killing explosives to watch like the far side of the room for explosives, and then the rest of the group to be focusing on killing the Heart Guardian and killing the hexers on the other side of the room. Once you've done that, you're kind of stabilized, and then you're okay, but for the first 30 seconds of each phase here, it can get very hectic as you have explosives spawning all over the place. Somebody like, a Moonkin dumping Star Surges, a Havoc Demon Hunter, or an Outlaw Rogue that's kind of dashing around on the other side and one-shotting the orbs on the other side is needed. Really important here. Beyond that, it's just going to be Tyrannical that's a problem in here, and these bosses are all pretty hard on Tyrannical. Bolstering Motherlode is a challenge because most of the good trash in this dungeon is in this first area, and by good, I mean trash that has a favorable ratio of hit points to the enemy forces that it gives. The best trash in this dungeon for that ratio is these Mechanized Peacekeepers, giving you 12 count each for only 2.6 million health on a plus 10 Tyrannical. That's a really good ratio, but the problem is those enemies are really tough to efficiently deal with in a bolstering environment. So this week, my route instead is going to be getting a lot more trash from this part of the dungeon, from this part of the dungeon. You're still getting quite a bit here, but it's not, something you might see in Motherlode sometimes is a route that just gets like 100% trash count from pulling all of this. And you can still do that this week, but I've really tried to avoid these off-duty laborer pulls, as these are the things that I think are the most painful with explosive or with bolstering active. Explosive not actually too bad in here, and tyrannical not too bad in here, so it's mostly just the bolstering that you've got to be thinking about every trash pull in here. In the Underrot, it's a pretty good week, so you have to watch out for bolstering in a couple spots, but you're never really obligated to pull a bunch of different enemies with different health totals. You do want to make sure that you're always focusing down any feral bloodswarmers that are active in any pull. It's generally better to bolster the rest of the pull by a little bit than it is to kill the bloodswarmer 30 seconds later and have it just be chasing down your team, because these things just do such a huge amount of damage. One common strategy that this route doesn't do, but what you can do is you can, if you want to pull this room in fewer pulls, in order to do that, you're going to need to add more bloodswarmers to each pull. Right now, I'm doing 1 bloodswarmer per pull, but if you wanted to do this room in fewer than 5 pulls, you need to do more than 1 bloodswarmer per pull. And a way to do this is to pull 5 enemies in a bloodswarmer, focus down that first bloodswarmer. When the bloodswarmer dies, the rest of the pack is at 40% health. They get a stack of bolstering. Not a big deal. You pull in the next bloodswarmer, you focus that down, everything dies at the same time. That's a way you can do this room a little bit more quickly this week, but it is, trickier to execute. So this is maybe a safer way to attack this room. The other thing that's kind of annoying this week is that it's tyrannical, and the obelisk that's over here in the spot that's kind of hard to get to efficiently is the fear guy. You can fight the fear guy with the last boss. It's not the end of the world to do that, especially if you have stuff like immunities for the fear, revival, mass dispel, tremor totem, warlock imp dispel. A lot of different effects here can help remove the fear effects from your group, make it not the end of the world to have that happen. But most groups, I'd say, are still pretty scared of fighting this thing with a tyrannical end boss. So for that reason, I've got a route here that goes and activates this obelisk. If you want to save some time, you're going to want to cut these pulls out of here. You can make it up with 1 pull somewhere else in the dungeon, and then fight Samrek with the last boss instead. Bolstering Tol Dagor, it's not actually the worst on death affix in here, because a lot of the enemies that are really painful with stuff like Sanguine and Bursting in here don't actually bolster onto each other. So stuff like these Despondent Scallywags, on Sanguine Week, it was really painful to pull one of these things in, get an extra Sanguine puddle dropping. On Bursting Week next week, it's going to be really painful to pull one of these in, extend an extra Bursting stack. But on Bolstering Week, these neutral mobs don't actually bolster the hostile enemies that you're fighting. So it's probably one of the better on-death affixes to be active in Tol Dagor. It is still pretty tricky, though. You have enemies fleeing in this area, and bolstering can get just a little bit hard to manage. Depending on how you use the cannon section, that can also be tricky if you're trying to fight a lot of enemies with cannons. First of all, you're going to get the potential of bolstering onto the few enemies that do survive, and that can be very deadly. And you have the potential of explosive spawning, which the cannon doesn't hit. So if you're trying to kill 10 enemies with cannons, you have one person who could be dealing with explosives in the cannon. A lot of the rest of the group, like line of sighting or trying to not get hit by those mechanics, they're going to have a harder time killing the explosives as well, and you have 10 enemies spawning explosives. So for that reason, I'd advise being a little bit more conservative with your cannons this week. Just pull 1 or 2 packs with each cannon, and keep things a little bit more manageable. Waycrest Manor, you're going to need to worry a little bit about bolstering in a few spots here. These Jagged Hounds in particular, you're going to want to make sure that you don't kill a bunch of those and bolster something up. This mini-boss here, Matron Brindle, the way to deal with this is option 1 is for a DPS player to run in and get threat on all 4 of these, and then a tank to quickly taunt the Matron herself. That'll let you separate the dogs from the Matron, and then you can kill these dogs really quickly before they kill your DPS player. Something like a Havoc Demon Hunter with Blur Up, really good way to be tanky against this, or a Warrior with Parry, something like that. Other option for this is to move the dogs away when Matron Brindle is channeling her Thorn Barrage, and you can kill them out of bolstering range when that's happening. The other option here is to just put 3 stacks of bolstering on her, depending on the keystone level. That might not be the end of the world, but it can be pretty scary. So that is, I think, a last resort here. One thing to remember, of course, is that maggots do not bolster, so you don't really have to worry about that affix too much in this area of the dungeon. Although some of the other enemies that do bolster do have different health totals than each other. Notably, these piglets have a lot less health than the other enemies. They have half as much health as these Revelers and a third as much health as these Pallid Gorgers. So watch out for the composition of your pulls here. If you're trying to do a big pull in this area, you may accidentally end up putting a stack or two of bolstering on everything pretty early from those piglets. So just be aware of that and play around that however your group decides is best. So in Junkyard, I think in the North American regions this week, the hard mode enemy is going to be flying above Gunker, preventing you from fighting this boss first. My route here shows a way that you can still get access to these great shock bots that are available if you go left without actually fighting Gunker first. So you're still going left, you're still pulling stuff over here as your first couple pulls, but you're not actually going into that hard mode area. And then you can take this obelisk over here and start working through these two bosses instead, and then get back to Gunker as your third boss. If you're in Europe or some of the other regions, I think that Gunker is actually going to be available first, so you can use last week's route instead and go fight Gunker first, and I think that will be a better strategy for you. But this week in North America, I think you're going to need to make that adjustment in order to not fight under the hard mode enemy, which you should never ever do. Workshop is really just about Tyrannical this week. There are a few enemies that can be painful with bolstering, particularly in this area. Here, so I'd pull these two enemies without pulling these wastes. You can tag this waste processing unit from a nice angle and avoid pulling these wastes. And then here you should just CC this Junkyard dog and fight either just these wastes or all 9 of these wastes, and then come back and fight the dog later. That's the best way to deal with bolstering this area, I think. And outside of that, not really too much that the affixes are going to add to the rest of the dungeon. That's it for this week in Mythic Plus. Hope this video helped. If it did, remember to hit like and subscribe, and check out my Twitch stream, twitch.tv/Dratnos. Thanks everybody for watching. I'll see you in the next one, where it's going to be a much better week for keys. Bye.